On the night before Easter, a 25-year-old schoolteacher drove 12 blocks through McAllen, Texas, and parked outside the church she trusted more than any place on earth. She told her parents she was going to confession. She said she would be home soon. Inside Sacred Heart, hundreds of people were waiting to confess their sins. Priests moved from one person to the next. Families filled the pews. The church was crowded enough that disappearing should have been impossible. But one priest took Irene Garza away from the others. He took her into the rectory. No one saw her leave. Her car was still sitting near the church. Her purse would later be found abandoned on a road outside town. Her veil would turn up in a field, and 5 days later, her body would be pulled from an irrigation canal. By then, investigators already had a suspect, the priest who had heard her last confession. His name was John Feit. He had scratches on his hands. A personal possession of his was found near the body. Another young woman had identified him in an earlier attack inside a church, and 2 priests would eventually say that Feit confessed to killing Irene. Still, nobody arrested him. Because somewhere inside the institution Irene had trusted, people had already begun discussing how to make the problem disappear. And 57 years later, a jury would finally hear what they had been trying to keep buried. This is the story of how long it took to get that letter in front of a jury. If this is your first time here, this is Cold Case Model, and this is the exact kind of case this channel exists for. Not the ones that were never solved. The ones that were solved almost immediately, and then buried by people who found the truth inconvenient. Subscribe if that is the kind of story you want more of, because Irene Garza waited 57 years for someone to say her name out loud in a courtroom, and the least we can do is keep saying it. But before the church, before the canal, before any of it, there are 2 people you need to understand. Because this story is not really about a night. It is about 2 lives that started about 1,100 miles apart, in the same decade, and spent 25 years walking toward the same building from opposite directions. Let us start with the ground she grew up on. The Rio Grande Valley is not a valley. It is a delta, a flat sweep of alluvial farmland at the southern tip of Texas, where the river finally gives up and turns into the Gulf. By the 1930s, it had been remade into an agricultural machine. Citrus groves, cotton, winter vegetables shipped north on refrigerated rail. The soil was rich, the growing season was long, and the labor was cheap, and everyone involved understood exactly why it was cheap. McAllen sat near the middle of it, close enough to the border that the 2 countries functioned as one economy and 2 legal systems. And like most towns in that part of Texas, McAllen was organized around a line. In McAllen, the line was a set of railroad tracks. North of them was the wealthier, largely Anglo side of the city. South of them was where most Mexican-American families lived, in the part of town people simply called Southtown. This was not informal. Across South Texas in that era, Mexican-American children were routinely funneled into separate schools, often justified on language grounds, and maintained long after the language argument stopped making sense. Public facilities were restricted. McAllen's public swimming pool had, within living memory of Irene's generation, barred Hispanic residents outright. In 1954, the year Irene was in college, the United States Supreme Court would rule in a case out of Texas that Mexican Americans had been systematically excluded from juries, which tells you something about how the state had been run for the previous half-century. None of that was abstract to the people living it. If you grew up brown in the valley, you did not need anyone to explain the geography to you. You learned it the way you learn weather. Irene Garza was born into that in 1934. Her parents were Nicholas and Josefina Garza, and what they were doing was the thing that was supposed to be impossible in a town built on that kind of line. They were building a business. The Garzas ran a dry cleaning operation. It was not glamorous work and it was not fast money. It was the kind of business that gets built by a man opening early and closing late for years at a stretch, and by a family that treats every customer as though the next month's rent depends on that person coming back, because it does. They started on the south side, where they were supposed to stay. And as the business grew and the family rose with it, the Garzas did something that in 1940s McAllen carried more weight than any speech. They bought a house north of the railroad tracks. Think about what that purchase actually was. Not a political act, not a protest, just a family with the money for a house on the other side of the line, buying a house on the other side of the line, and in doing so making a statement that nobody had to say out loud, to neighbors who had never expected to have that conversation. Irene grew up in that house, on that side, as a girl whose family had crossed something. She then spent her adolescence crossing more of them. At McAllen High School, Irene became the first Latina head drum majorette in the school's history. That sounds like a small distinction until you sit with what it involved. The drum major position is the most visible role a student can hold at a public high school in Texas. It is the person out front of the band on a Friday night, in uniform, in the center of the field, in front of the entire town. In a school in a town where a Mexican-American girl had simply never been given that position, Irene took it, and she took it in the most conspicuous way available. The people who knew her then were consistent about one thing. She was not campaigning. She was not making a point. She was just extremely good at something, in public, in front of people who had assumed she would not be. And that has a way of making a wall look shorter than it did the previous season. She went on to Pan American College, which for a Valley kid in that era was the achievable university, the one you could reach without leaving your family behind. There she was crowned homecoming queen and prom queen. In 1958, she was named Miss All South Texas Sweetheart, a regional title in a part of the state where pageant culture was a genuine social institution, and the crowns tended to land on Anglo girls. She was also the first person in her family to attend college, and then the first to go on to graduate study. Photographs from those years show a young woman in pillbox hats and sweater sets, carefully put together, poised in the way people were taught to be poised in 1958. Fair-skinned, polished, entirely at ease in front of a camera. Now hold that image and go north. Because while Irene Garza was learning a routine on a football field in South Texas, a boy in Chicago was being prepared for something else entirely. John Bernard Feit was born in November of 1932, 2 years before Irene, the youngest of 3 children in a German Catholic family in Chicago. Understand what that meant in that era, in that city. Chicago Catholicism in the 1930s and 40s was not a Sunday affiliation. It was an infrastructure. You were born in a Catholic hospital. You were educated in a parish school. Your neighborhood was identified by its parish rather than its street grid. And the priest was the most consequential man most families ever dealt with directly. The Feit family was deep inside that structure. His uncle was a priest. His brother would become one. And at 13 years old, John Feit was sent away to become one too. He was enrolled in an all-boys minor seminary in San Antonio, operated by his order. If you did not grow up Catholic before the 1960s, that sentence probably does not register properly, so here is what it meant. The minor seminary was a boarding high school for boys who were being formed for the priesthood, and boys entered at 13 or 14. The schedule was structured around prayer. Contact with the outside world was limited. Contact with women was, functionally, eliminated. The entire environment existed to produce a specific kind of man, and it started before the boy was old enough to have any idea what he was agreeing to. That was not unusual at the time. Thousands of American boys went through it. Most of them turned out fine, and many of them left partway through and went on to ordinary lives. But it is worth noticing the shape of the thing. At the age when Irene Garza was entering McAllen High School and discovering how far she could go in public, John Feit was entering an institution designed to remove him from the public entirely and hand him back a decade later with authority attached. He stayed. He completed the formation. He joined a missionary order and was ordained a priest in September of 1958. The same year, Irene Garza was crowned Miss All South Texas Sweetheart. 2 people, 600 miles apart, at the peaks of 2 completely different kinds of life. Within 9 months they would be in the same building. The reason Feit came to the Valley is bureaucratic and almost boring, which is somehow worse. South Texas had a severe shortage of priests. The Catholic population was enormous, heavily Mexican-American, and desperately underserved by clergy. Orders sent men down to fill the gap, and newly ordained priests were routinely posted there for pastoral training, meaning practical experience under an established pastor before a permanent assignment. Feit arrived at Sacred Heart Church in McAllen in June of 1959. He was 26 years old, articulate, well-mannered, and fluent in Spanish, which made him immediately useful in a parish where most of the congregation prayed in it. Parishioners who met him then split into two camps, and the split is worth noting because it never really closed. One group found him charming, educated, polished, a good speaker, the kind of young priest a parish is pleased to be assigned. The other group found him cold, aloof, a man who maintained a careful distance from everyone around him and seemed a little too comfortable in his own company. There is a remark attributed to him from that period that people repeated for decades afterward. Asked why he had become a priest, he reportedly said that he just wanted to give it a try. That is a strange answer from a man who had been in seminary since he was 13. Meanwhile, on the other side of that same town, Irene Garza had made a decision about her own life that would define how an entire community remembered her. She could have taught anywhere. A woman with her education, her credentials, and her public profile had options. Instead, she took a second-grade classroom at an elementary school on McAllen's south side, back across the tracks her family had crossed, at a school serving the city's poorest children. Many of her students came from the colonias. If that word is unfamiliar, it needs explaining, because it is central to understanding what she did every day. The colonias were unincorporated settlements along the Texas border, tracts of land subdivided and sold to low-income families, largely without the infrastructure that incorporation would have required. That meant, in practical terms, that a colonia might have no paved roads, no sewer connection, and no reliable running water. Some had no electricity. Families built incrementally, a room at a time, as money allowed. Many of these settlements had no legal mechanism forcing anyone to fix any of it, and the state of Texas would not seriously confront the problem for another 30 years. Those were the homes Irene Garza's 7-year-olds walked out of every morning. Some of them came to school barefoot, some came without supplies, some came hungry, and their teacher was the person who found out. According to her family, Irene spent her first paycheck buying clothes and books for those children. Sit with that for a second, because it is easy to let a line like that slide past. This was a woman at the absolute peak of her local celebrity, a former queen with a graduate education and a family business behind her, and the first money she earned as a professional went to shoes for other people's children. Teachers who worked alongside her described someone who gave everything she had to those kids, and then somehow located more to give. It was not a story that emerged after her death, when everyone becomes a saint. It was what people said about her while she was alive. And underneath all of it was the thing that would eventually kill her. Irene Garza was seriously, structurally devout. She belonged to the Legion of Mary, a lay Catholic association whose members commit to organized prayer and to active service work in their parish. That is not a group you drift into. It carries obligations and it requires showing up. She attended Mass and took communion every single day. Not Sundays, every day. Before school, in a church a few blocks from her house, on a schedule she kept without anyone asking her to. You have to understand the position that put her in. For Irene Garza, the church was not one institution among several that she interacted with. It was the load-bearing wall. It was where she went first, where she went daily, and where she went when something was wrong. The priests of that parish were not service providers to her. They were the men who stood between her and God, and she had been raised, as her whole community had been raised, to treat that as literally true. Parishioners later said that some men came to Mass at Sacred Heart simply because she would be there. 7 days before she died, Irene sat down and wrote a long letter to a friend. She wrote about ordinary things. She had been elected secretary of the Parent-Teacher Association, and she was pleased about it. She wrote about her students. She described herself as extremely shy and said she felt she was finally getting better at it. And then she wrote something that is almost unbearable to read now. She wrote that she had once been afraid of death, and that taking communion every day had taken that fear away from her. She wrote that her faith had given her a kind of courage and a kind of happiness that she had not known was available to her. 1 week later, she walked into the building that had given her that. Remember that letter. We are going to come back to it at the very end of this, and it is going to mean something different than it does right now. April 16, 1960 was Holy Saturday, the night before Easter Sunday. In a heavily Catholic community, that was one of the most crowded nights on the entire church calendar. People wanted to enter Easter morning with a clean conscience, which meant confession, which meant lines. At Sacred Heart that evening, the confession lines stretched back through the sanctuary. Several priests were hearing confessions simultaneously just to move the crowd through. Irene left home sometime around 6:30 in the evening. She had borrowed the family car. She told her mother she was going to confession and that she would not be long. Multiple parishioners saw her inside that church, and their accounts became critical evidence 57 years later. One watched her make the sign of the cross as she came in. One saw her kneeling alone in a pew several rows back, a white lace veil over her head. Another said Irene approached her and asked whether she could move ahead in the confession line, and apologized for asking, saying that she was running late. That is the last independently witnessed thing Irene Garza did. She apologized to a stranger for asking to go ahead of her. Among the priests hearing confessions that night was Father John Feit. What happened next is where the evening stops making sense, and it has never made sense since. Feit acknowledged that he heard Irene's confession, but he did not hear it in the sanctuary, through the screen, in the confessional, the way every other confession in that building was heard that night and every night. He took her into the rectory, a private room in a separate building, away from the other parishioners, away from the other priests, and away from anyone who might have seen or heard anything at all. People who understood church protocol were unequivocal about this afterward, and they have been unequivocal about it ever since. Removing a young woman from the public confession line and taking her into a private room was not an unusual variation on procedure. It was not a shortcut. It was something that was not supposed to happen, and the reason it was not supposed to happen is exactly the reason it happened here. Parishioners standing in his line noticed something else that night. The line stopped moving. He was gone for long stretches. People waiting on him grew confused, then irritated, as the minutes stacked up and the priest simply did not come back. And then there is the fact that investigators could never get past in 1960 or in 2017, in a church packed to the walls on the busiest confession night of the year, with a lit sanctuary and lines of people facing the doors. Not one single person saw Irene Garza leave. Not one. Her car sat parked down the street, untouched. At home, Josefina and Nicholas waited. They assumed at first that she had stayed for the Easter Vigil, which ran late in most parishes on that particular night. It was a reasonable assumption. It bought them a few hours of not being frightened. Then midnight passed. Then 1. Then 2. The house stayed quiet, and the front door stayed shut, and at some point in there the assumption stopped working, and something else took its place. At 3 in the morning on Easter Sunday, Nicholas Garza drove to the McAllen Police Department and reported his daughter missing. It was the holiest morning of the Christian year. He was standing at a counter in the dark, trying to explain to an officer that his 25-year-old daughter had gone to confession and had not come back. Easter Sunday came and went with nothing. On April 18th, 2 days after she vanished, things began turning up along McCall Road, on the outskirts of McAllen. A passerby spotted a single beige high-heeled shoe near the curb. A teacher from Irene's own school found her black patent leather purse lying in a field a short distance off. Her driver's license was still inside it. Further along, someone found the white lace veil that parishioners had watched her wearing in that pew 2 nights earlier. Nobody in her family wanted to read what that trail said, but it said something specific, and it said it clearly. After Irene disappeared from inside a church full of people, somebody had driven that stretch of road with her belongings and had put them out one at a time. What followed was the largest search operation in the recorded history of the Rio Grande Valley. Roughly 70 members of the Hidalgo County Sheriff's Posse rode out across the brush country on horseback. Divers went into the irrigation canals. Border Patrol aircraft flew grid patterns above the fields. Dozens of National Guardsmen joined the ground search on foot, walking shoulder to shoulder through ditches and furrows. Hundreds of volunteers organized their own parties without waiting to be asked, because Irene was their neighbor or their child's teacher, or their friend, or the girl they had watched lead the band down a football field 10 years earlier. An entire city mobilized around one missing woman, which tells you something about the woman. And every few hours, hope got manufactured and then destroyed. A woman telephoned claiming to be Irene, saying she had been kidnapped in a nearby town. It was a hoax, and someone in that family had to be told it was a hoax. A man walked into a police station and confessed to killing her. Detectives worked him for hours before concluding the confession was fabricated, and someone had to go tell the Garzas that too. Then came Thursday, April 21st. At roughly 7:40 in the morning, McAllen Police received a call. Something was floating in an irrigation canal near 2nd Street, a concrete channel running through a busy commercial part of the city, in plain view of a department store. It was Irene. She was still wearing most of her clothing. Her shoes and undergarments were missing. There was significant visible injury to the right side of her face. The cause of death recorded at the time was head trauma, producing a brain hemorrhage, combined with suffocation. And the medical findings carried an implication that investigators found very difficult to sit with. The condition of her body indicated she had been dead for somewhat less than 4 days. She had disappeared on Saturday night. Do that arithmetic slowly, and what you get is a gap. And the gap means that Irene Garza was almost certainly alive, somewhere, held, for the better part of a day after she walked into that church. The canal water had destroyed most of what a 1960 laboratory could have used, but the bank had not been washed. There was a man's shoe print pressed into the mud near the water's edge, and a strand of Irene's hair caught in it. There were tire tracks along the bank. There was an impression in the soil where something heavy had been set down and then dragged toward the water. Candelabra belonging to Sacred Heart Church were recovered from the canal, and when the canal was drained weeks later, investigators found one more object sitting in the silt, close to where her body had been floating. A small green Kodak slide viewer with a long black cord attached to it, the kind of personal item a man carries in a pocket. It belonged to John Feit. He said so himself. He told investigators he had bought it the previous summer at a drugstore in Port Isabel. What he never explained, to police in 1960, to prosecutors in 1962, to a grand jury, to a journalist, or to a jury 57 years later, was how his personal property came to be, lying at the bottom of an irrigation canal beside a dead woman. In the days after the recovery, Feit's account of Holy Saturday changed, and investigators noticed immediately. His first version was that Irene had come to the rectory with a question of conscience, and that he had simply directed her back toward the sanctuary. Under sharper questioning, he revised it. He admitted that he had actually heard her confession privately, in the rectory. That revision was the entire case compressed into one sentence. By his own account, revised under pressure, he was the last person alone with Irene Garza, in a private room, in a building she had no reason to enter, with no witnesses. There was also the matter of his hands. Father Joseph O'Brien was the assistant pastor at Sacred Heart, and by every description a warm and genuinely well-liked man. After the late Mass that Holy Saturday, O'Brien noticed fresh scratches on Feit's hands. Feit had an explanation ready, which is itself worth noting. He said his glasses had broken during the evening. He said he had driven 5 miles to a pastoral house in San Juan to retrieve another pair. He said he had found himself locked out. And he said he had climbed to a second-floor balcony to get inside, scraping his hands on the brick as he went. Read that back. 5 miles. In the middle of hearing confessions, on the single busiest confession night of the church year, with a line of parishioners waiting on him. To retrieve eyeglasses from a building he could not enter through the front door, requiring him to scale the exterior. That explanation was offered in 1960, and it never got better with age. And then investigators found out that this had very nearly happened 3 weeks earlier, to somebody else. On March 23, 1960, a 20-year-old college student named Maria America Guerra was kneeling at the communion rail inside Sacred Heart Church in Edinburg, roughly 12 miles north of McAllen. She was alone in the church. She was praying the rosary. A man came up behind her, seized her, and tried to force a cloth over her mouth. She fought him. She got his finger in her teeth, and bit down hard enough to draw blood freely, and when he let go of her, she ran. When she reported the assault, she told police something specific. She said she believed her attacker had been a priest. Investigators connected the incident to John Feit quickly, and the connections were not subtle. He acknowledged having been at that church in Edinburg earlier the same day. He drove a blue and white Ford sedan, matching the description that multiple witnesses gave of a car seen near the church around the time of the attack. And his right hand was injured. He told colleagues back at Sacred Heart in McAllen that he had hurt his finger on a mimeograph machine. A church secretary who actually looked at the wound said flatly that what she was looking at were bite marks. Teeth, not gears. Maria America Guerra viewed a lineup and identified John Feit as the man who attacked her. A witness to the assault identified him as well. Now set the two cases beside each other, because this is the part that stopped the Garza case from being a tragedy and made it a pattern. A young woman attacked while praying alone inside a church. Another young woman killed after going to confession inside a church. Both of them alone, both of them in the middle of an act of faith, in the one place in their lives where they would have been least on guard, because being on guard there would have been unthinkable. Both incidents in the same county, 3 weeks apart, connected to the same 27-year-old visiting priest. McAllen Police brought in an elite polygraph firm from Chicago to examine him. The testing ran across 2 full days in June of 1960, which is an extraordinary amount of examination time and tells you how seriously they were taking it. The examiners concluded that the results implicated him in both crimes, and that in their professional assessment, he was not telling the truth when he denied killing Irene Garza or attacking Maria America Guerra. And according to accounts of that examination, John Feit said something to the examiners that people involved in this case have been repeating ever since. He told them, calmly, that no evidence was ever going to turn up, and that without a confession, they did not have enough to convict him. He was right for 57 years. There is a footnote to the polygraph that deserves its own moment. McAllen Police initially told the press that Feit had passed. That was not true. The result was later quietly restated as inconclusive, and the original examiner would eventually say, years afterward, that he had believed all along that Feit had failed it. So take stock of what law enforcement in Hidalgo County was holding by the summer of 1960. The scratches, with an explanation that fell apart on contact. The story that changed under questioning. His personal property recovered from the canal beside the body. A nearly identical assault 3 weeks earlier, in a church, with a surviving victim who identified him by sight and an independent witness who did the same. A specialist firm reporting that he was lying about both, and his own admission that he had taken her, alone, into a private room, deliberately, away from every other person in that building. That is not a thin, circumstantial case. That is the kind of file a prosecutor builds a career on. Nothing happened. And the reason nothing happened is where this story stops being sad and starts being something else. The Guerra assault went to trial first. In 1961, Feit was tried in Austin over the attack on Maria America Guerra. The jury deadlocked, reportedly with a substantial majority in favor of conviction. Rather than face a retrial where those numbers were unlikely to move in his favor, his lawyers negotiated. In 1962, John Feit pleaded no contest to a reduced charge of aggravated assault, a misdemeanor. His punishment was a fine of $500. He did not spend a single day in custody for attacking a woman in a church. Years later, he would claim that he had not even understood that a no-contest plea counted as a conviction. But that plea deal was only one half of an arrangement, and the other half was never entered into any court record anywhere. At his murder trial in 2017, an attorney and former television reporter took the stand and testified about a conversation he had witnessed decades earlier. He said the district attorney of that era had gathered a small group of media people for an off-the-record briefing and had told them plainly that both prosecutors and Catholic Church officials knew that John Feit had murdered Irene Garza. The arrangement, according to that testimony, worked like this. Feit would plead down on the Guerra assault. The Hidalgo County District Attorney's Office would not pursue a murder charge in the Garza case, and the church would handle the remainder. by moving him out of Texas and disciplining him internally, away from public scrutiny. The Garza family would not be told any of it. The community would eventually move on. The scandal would die of neglect. And the proof that this was real, and not the theory of a grieving family, had been sitting in church files the entire time. It was a letter, dated the 1st of August 1960, less than 4 months after Irene died, written by one priest in the order to another who oversaw the province. That letter was subpoenaed for the 2017 trial, and when it was read aloud in a Hidalgo County courtroom, 57 years after it was typed, the room reacted the way rooms react to something that cannot be argued with. The letter relayed advice attributed to the county sheriff, who was himself Catholic. The recommendation was that the church transfer Feit to another part of the country, framed as an ordinary reassignment, in order to move him out of the area of suspicion. The letter stated that the longer time went on, the weaker the case would get. It warned that the Garza matter could give opponents of the church a field day. And it raised a concern that has to be read twice to be believed. It flagged the risk that the case could become a scandal exploited against John Kennedy during that year's presidential campaign, at a moment when a Catholic candidate was fighting anti-Catholic prejudice on a national stage. 1960 was the year Kennedy stood in front of a room of Protestant ministers in Houston to argue that his faith would not govern his presidency. It was a genuine and serious political crisis for American Catholics, and the men handling the aftermath of Irene Garza's murder were weighing her death as a variable in it. The letter discussed strategy, it discussed optics, it discussed politics, it discussed the survival of an institution, and across all of those carefully composed paragraphs, the letter never once used Irene Garza's name. Not once. It did not name her parents. It did not name the 25-year-old second-grade teacher who walked into one of their churches on the holiest night of the year and did not walk back out. It did not name the woman whose murder was the only reason the letter existed at all. She was simply not in the document that decided her killer's future. So here is the one thing I am going to ask you for in this video. Put her name in the comments. Just Irene Garza, nothing else. Because the document that disposed of her case managed to leave her out of it entirely, and the least this comment section can do is put her back in. The silence was not only maintained on paper, between officials, in private. It was enforced out loud, from a pulpit, directly to the faces of people who were grieving. At a service held at another parish in the aftermath of her death, in front of a congregation that included people who had known Irene personally, people who had taught alongside her, and parents of children she had clothed with her own money, a priest reportedly told the room that it was impossible for a priest to commit a crime like this, that they should not speak of it, and that they should not even allow themselves to think it. You have to place that instruction in its actual context to understand what it did. This was a community where a priest's word carried the weight of instruction from God, where the church was not one civic institution among many, but the organizing structure of family life, where questioning a priest publicly was close to unthinkable for most of the people in that room. Told from the altar that suspecting a priest was itself sinful, families with suspicions stopped voicing them. People who had seen things at Sacred Heart that night stopped telling anyone. An entire community's instinct to demand an answer was smothered by being informed that wanting the answer was a spiritual failing. That is how you bury a murder in plain sight, not with a conspiracy of 100 people, with one sentence, from the right man, in the right building. Irene's cousin Noemi Sigler later described a memory that shows what that silence cost the people inside it. Her father had been one of the original investigating deputies on the Garza case. She remembered him sitting at the family kitchen table one evening, weeping, after being ordered to turn over his investigative files and step aside so that higher-ranking officials could take control. He understood exactly what was happening to the case. He understood what it meant for the family he was related to, and he understood there was nothing he could do about it. That is a man who did his job correctly and was removed for it, and his daughter watched it happen, and 30 years later that memory would become the engine of the entire case. Once the plea deal closed the door on prosecution, the Catholic Church began moving John Feit. First to a Trappist monastery in Iowa. then to an abbey in Missouri, then in 1966 to a treatment center in New Mexico, operated by a religious order for priests with behavioral problems. Follow the geography. Texas to Iowa to Missouri to New Mexico. Each transfer added distance between him and the county where he had killed a woman, between him and the evidence, and between him and anybody who remembered the name Irene Garza. And here is the part of that sequence that is difficult to get past. At that New Mexico facility, John Feit did not merely receive treatment. He rose into a supervisory role. At one point, he held responsibility for evaluating which troubled priests were fit to return to active ministry. Read that again slowly. A man who 2 separate priests would say had confessed to killing a woman inside a church was placed in a position of assessing whether other men with problems should be sent back out to parishes. That is what the institution did with him. Not discipline, promotion, inside the system built to contain men like him. But while John Feit was quietly assembling a second life inside those walls, the truth was working its way toward daylight through the least likely channel available to it. In 1963, at the monastery in Missouri, a young monk named Tacheny was assigned to counsel Feit through a series of sessions. Tacheny was earnest and devoted to his vocation, and he understood at the beginning that he was dealing with a man in some kind of spiritual crisis. That is the job. A monk counsels a troubled brother. It is one of the most ordinary things that happens inside a monastery. According to Tacheny's later sworn testimony, John Feit told him what he had done. Feit described hearing a young woman's confession over Easter weekend and then attacking her. He described binding and gagging her and putting her in the basement of the rectory. He said he left the building and that when he came back later, she was dead. And Tacheny testified to one detail that he carried with him for the rest of his life. Feit told him that as he was walking away, he could hear her saying that she could not breathe. When he returned, she was gone. Tacheny also testified that Feit explained how he had escaped consequence for it, and the explanation was 3 parts. In Feit's own account, the church had helped him, law enforcement had helped him, and the seal of confession had helped him. That is a man reciting the 3 walls he was standing behind, out loud, to another man inside one of them. Tacheny did not go to the police. And this is where his character stops being a footnote and becomes the second most important person in this story, so it is worth being precise about it, rather than either condemning him or excusing him. He was a young monk. He was living inside the institution that was actively protecting the man sitting across from him. He had entered religious life the way people entered it then, meaning young, completely, and with the understanding that obedience to the order was the substance of the vocation rather than a condition of it. Going to civil authorities meant setting himself against the entire structure his life was built on the word of one man, with no proof, about a crime in a state he had never been to. He stayed silent. He stayed silent for close to 40 years. He eventually left religious life. He married. He built an ordinary existence far from monasteries. And the entire time, according to what he said later, he carried what he had been told, and he thought about a family in Texas he had never met, who did not know what he knew. Nothing about the next 4 decades of his life makes sense unless you understand that he was carrying it the whole time. There was a second confession, from someone standing much closer to the crime. Father Joseph O'Brien, the assistant pastor who had noticed the scratches on Feit's hands on Holy Saturday, never let it go. He had known Irene, the whole parish had, and the questions did not stop bothering him when everyone else was instructed to stop asking them. He confronted Feit repeatedly over the following weeks and months. And eventually, at the order's headquarters in San Antonio, John Feit broke down and admitted the murder to him directly. O'Brien did not go to the police either. He would later explain his reasoning. He did not want to embarrass his order, and he expected that Feit would simply deny everything and sue him. So instead of going to the authorities, Father O'Brien went to Irene's parents. He sat down with Nicholas and Josefina Garza and told them that the discipline the church would impose on John Feit internally would be more severe than anything a court of law would hand down. That was not true, and O'Brien knew it was not true at the moment he said it. because he was inside the order that was moving Feit from state to state. The church was not disciplining him. The church was relocating him. There was no internal penalty in existence that corresponded to the taking of a human life. There was an institution protecting itself, delivered to two grieving parents in the vocabulary of spiritual authority, by a priest they trusted, in their own home. Two confessions, two men who knew, with certainty, who killed Irene Garza, and decades of silence, because the two people who heard the truth were both standing inside the structure that had decided the truth was worth less than its own comfort. In the early 1970s, John Feit left the priesthood entirely. He married, he moved to the Phoenix area, and eventually settled in Scottsdale, Arizona. He raised 3 children. He took a job in food service management. For roughly 17 years, he volunteered with a Catholic charity that serves the poor. He lived, by every outward measure available, a completely unremarkable suburban American life. And that is the part that is hardest to hold in your head, so let us hold it deliberately for a moment. While Nicholas and Josefina Garza were growing old without an answer, John Feit was going to work. While Irene's students were growing up and having children of their own, he was coaching, driving, paying a mortgage, showing up at church functions. He was, to every neighbor who ever waved at him from a driveway, a quiet, aging, entirely forgettable retiree. If you had met him at a neighborhood barbecue in 1990, you would have shaken his hand and forgotten him before you reached your car. He was free for nearly 6 decades. Irene Garza's family was not. In the valley, her case became something people discussed quietly and almost never in public. It faded out of the newspapers. It became one of those things a town knows and does not say, referenced obliquely at family gatherings, and then dropped. It did not fade inside her family, and it did not fade inside one woman in particular. Noemi Sigler was Irene's cousin, and the daughter of the deputy who had wept at that kitchen table after being pushed off the case. She had grown up inside both halves of it, the murder and the burial of the murder. She gave more than 30 years of her life to keeping the investigation alive, and she did it largely without institutional help of any kind. She tracked down witnesses who had scattered across the country over the decades and found them one at a time. She cataloged every piece of evidence she could get her hands on and kept her own files. She submitted requests to police departments and prosecutors' offices. She attended public meetings where the case might conceivably come up. She cornered every new police chief, every new district attorney, and every journalist who passed through McAllen, and she made them sit there and listen to the name Irene Garza. Understand what that requires. Not the first year. The 22nd, going back to the same offices, to new occupants of the same chairs, to be told the same thing in slightly different language, and going back again the following year. Another cousin, Linda de la Vigna, fought beside her with the same refusal to be handled politely and sent home. Between them, 2 women with no badge, no law license, and no subpoena power became the unofficial custodians of an unsolved homicide, and they held that position for 3 decades against an entire county's institutional preference for letting it go. In 2002, something finally moved. McAllen's police chief formally asked the newly created Texas Rangers Unsolved Crimes Investigation Team to take a fresh look at the Garza case, and a ranger lieutenant was assigned to lead it. And that same year, on the other side of the country, Dale Tacheny picked up a telephone. Nearly 40 years removed from that Missouri monastery, out of religious life, an older man now, he called a detective in San Antonio and told him that in 1963, a priest had confessed to him about attacking and killing a young woman over Easter weekend. There was a complication, and it nearly ended everything. Tacheny remembered being told the crime happened in San Antonio, so the lead stalled, because San Antonio police went looking for a matching case and did not have one. It took a Texas Ranger, recognizing the parallels between Tacheny's account and the details in a 40-year-old file in McAllen, for the pieces to lock together. The ranger then located Father Joseph O'Brien, now elderly and in declining health, and for the first time on the record, O'Brien confirmed it. John Feit had admitted the murder of Irene Garza to him directly, shortly after the crime. 2 confessions, given independently, decades apart, in different states, to two men who had never coordinated with each other, both corroborated 40 years after the fact. The case should have been charged that year. It was not, because the man with the power to charge it did not want to. The Hidalgo County District Attorney at that time had held the office for around 3 decades and was a political institution in his own right. Under public pressure, he took the case to a grand jury in 2004. He did not subpoena Dale Tacheny. He did not call Father Joseph O'Brien. He did not call John Feit. He walked into a grand jury room with the confessions removed from the case, and the grand jury did the only thing it could reasonably do with what it had been handed. It declined to indict. When the family objected, he reportedly told Linda de la Viña directly that they were never going to get an indictment, and when a reporter later asked him why anyone was still troubled by the case, his answer, as reported at the time, was that she died and her killer got away. That is the low point of this story, not 1960-2004, because in 1960 they could at least pretend the evidence was thin, and in 2004 2 men had come forward, on the record, and the office responsible for acting on it chose not to put them in the room. In April of 2005, Texas Monthly published a long investigative piece by the journalist Pamela Coliff that laid the entire thing out: the evidence, the church's involvement, the prosecutor's inaction, the family's decades in the wilderness. It landed at the exact moment the Catholic clergy abuse scandal was dominating American headlines, which meant a national audience was finally primed to believe every word of it. A network news magazine followed with a televised investigation of its own. The pressure built and kept building. The district attorney still did not move, and then the case lost something it could not replace. Father Joseph O'Brien died in September of 2005, at 77 years old. He never testified under oath. His account would eventually reach a jury, but only second-hand, through a journalist who had interviewed him before his death. Every year of delay in this case cost the eventual prosecution something specific, and that is what one of those years cost. A living witness to a confession, gone, because the man who could have put him in front of a grand jury the previous year had decided not to. Then, in 2014, a former district judge named Ricardo Rodriguez Jr. decided to run against the incumbent. Rodriguez was the son of migrant farm workers. He had grown up in the valley, worked his way through law school, and risen to the bench in the same county where Irene Garza had been buried without an answer. He made the Garza case a centerpiece of his campaign, and he did it in the most exposed way available. He told voters plainly, publicly, and repeatedly that if they elected him, he would pursue it, not as an aspiration, as a commitment he could be held to. Irene's family believed him, and then they went to work for him. Noemi Sigler and Linda de la Viña threw themselves into that campaign. They knocked on doors. They told their story to anyone who would stand still long enough to hear it. They looked voters in the face and said that this man would finally do the thing that nobody had been willing to do for 54 years. Rodriguez won with roughly 64% of the vote. It was not close. After decades of being told to accept it, to be quiet, to move on, the people of Hidalgo County voted in overwhelming numbers for the man who promised to try. He took office in January of 2015. By April, he had formally reopened the case. His office assembled a prosecution team, located surviving witnesses, and began the work of rebuilding a murder case out of evidence that was more than half a century old, in a county where most of the original investigators were dead. In February of 2016, a Hidalgo County grand jury, this time actually shown the evidence and the witnesses, returned an indictment. John Bernard Feit was charged with the murder of Irene Garza. He was 83 years old, living in quiet retirement in Scottsdale, Arizona. On February 9, 2016, law enforcement officers came to his door. His recorded response, when they told him why they were there, was that he had been questioned extensively about this going back to 1960, and that he was disappointed but not surprised. He was extradited to Texas. He pleaded not guilty. Bond was set at $1 million, and he spent 648 days in the Hidalgo County Jail, waiting for trial. 57 years after Irene Garza walked into Sacred Heart Church, the man who killed her, was finally going to face 12 people who had never been told not to think about it. The trial opened on November 30th, 2017, in State District Court in Edinburg, Texas. The gallery was full. Garza family on one side, national media on the other. The prosecution called 22 witnesses across 7 days. In opening, the lead prosecutor described Feit as a wolf in priest's clothing, a predator who had come to the Rio Grande Valley to find prey. The case rested on 2 legs. The first was the circumstantial evidence from 1960. The slide viewer, the scratches, the story that changed, the assault on Maria America Guerra, the polygraph findings. The second was the confessions, the testimony of the men John Feit had told the truth to, back when he was certain the truth would never reach a courtroom. The witness the entire trial turned on was Dale Tacheny. He was elderly now. He had been carrying this for 54 years. He took the stand and recounted what John Feit had told him in that Missouri monastery in 1963. The confession, the rectory, the basement. What Feit said he heard her saying as he walked away, and what he found when he came back. And then the prosecution asked him the question that every person in that room was already asking, and that he had presumably been asking himself since the Kennedy administration. Why did you wait 40 years? His answer was 3 words. She had parents. The courtroom stopped. Jurors were seen wiping their eyes. Family members in the gallery wept openly, because those 3 words contained the entire weight of it. Nicholas and Josefina Garza had spent the rest of their lives without an answer, and had died without one, and a man in Missouri had been holding that answer the whole time, and knew it, and had done the arithmetic on what his silence had cost 2 people he never met. He did not offer an excuse. He did not explain the institutional pressure, or his age at the time, or any of the entirely real reasons a 20-something monk in 1963 did not walk into a police station. He gave the jury the only thing that actually mattered about those 40 years, which was that there had been 2 people at the other end of them. Other witnesses stacked the case up around him. A lifelong friend of Irene's testified that during Holy Week in 1960, days before the murder, Irene had confided in her that she was unsettled by a new priest, and that he had previously pulled her out of the standard confession line and into the rectory. Understand what that testimony did. It meant that Holy Saturday was not the first time. It meant Irene had noticed. It meant she had been uncomfortable enough to say so out loud to a friend, and that she went back anyway, because she was 25 years old in 1960, and the alternative was not going to church. A former cook and secretary at the church testified about a disturbing remark Feit had made to her, and testified that after Irene's murder, she received a threatening telephone call telling her that she was next. A former newspaper reporter took the stand to convey what Father O'Brien had told him in interviews before his death, including Feit's direct admission of the murder. And then the letter from August of 1960 was read aloud to the jury. The recommendation to transfer him out of the area of suspicion, the observation that time would weaken the case, the concern about a presidential campaign. 12 jurors in 2017 sat in a Texas courtroom and listened to a document written in 1960, prove, in the church's own words, on the church's own letterhead, that the cover-up was not a theory and never had been. It was coordinated, it was written down, and it was executed with the full knowledge that a woman was dead. An expert on clergy abuse testified for the prosecution that in his entire career studying institutional abuse within the Catholic Church, this was the first time he had ever seen an organized plan of obfuscation and collusion laid out step by step, in coordination with civilian law enforcement. Coming from a man who has spent decades reading exactly these files, that is not a small sentence. The defense fought on the only ground available to it, and it should be said that it was not nothing. No physical evidence, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no eyewitness to the killing itself. Counsel attacked the slide viewer as circumstantial and pointed to genuine gaps in the surviving 1960 police records. He argued that Tacheny's testimony should have been shielded by the privilege between a priest and a penitent, and he pointed out that John Feit had lived a law-abiding life for more than half a century. Feit did not testify. He sat through his own murder trial chewing gum and making notes on a legal pad. Reporters in the room noted no visible reaction from him at any point, including while Dale Tacheny described the confession, and while the letter was read, and while family members wept behind him. When word came that the jury was returning, he removed his hearing aids. On December 7, 2017, at 17 minutes past 8 in the evening, after roughly 6 hours of deliberation, a jury of 7 women and 5 men returned a verdict. Guilty of murder. The next day they reconvened for sentencing. The prosecutor asked for a symbolic 57 years, one for every year Feit had lived free while the family waited. He told the jury that instead of praying for her soul, this man had preyed on a victim. The defense asked for probation, on the grounds that Feit was elderly and had no criminal record in the intervening decades. The jury rejected both positions. They sentenced John Bernard Feit to life in prison. Before sentence was formally imposed, the court heard from the people he had taken her from. Irene's high school sweetheart stood up in that courtroom, faced the man who had killed the woman he had loved when they were both young, and told him that he was glad the jury had given him life, and that it was still nowhere near what he had done to her. And when it was finally over, that courtroom came apart. 57 years of held grief broke at once. Noemi Sigler, who had given more than 30 years of her life to reaching that single afternoon, collapsed into the arms of the prosecutor and wept. Linda de la Vigna found the former police chief who had asked the Rangers to reopen the case 15 years earlier and held on to him. Family members knelt on the floor of the courtroom and prayed. Some just stood, looking at nothing, unable to process that a day they had stopped expecting had actually arrived. Sigler told reporters that justice had been served, that Irene had finally gotten her day in court, and that it was all they had ever wanted. Linda de la Vigna said that it had been a long-awaited moment, and that after 57 years they had found justice for Irene, and had spoken truth to the power of the Catholic Church, and to the power of the political leadership in Hidalgo County that had let them down. And one family member walked toward the defense table, pointed directly at him, and said that he remembered his grandfather, and how this man had destroyed his grandfather's faith in God, and that his grandfather never went back to church again. That sentence describes damage no verdict can reach. The murder of Irene Garza did not only take her, it went through an entire community's relationship with the institution it had trusted most completely. For decades, people in the valley lived with the knowledge that the church they brought their children to, the church they went to for comfort and forgiveness, had weighed a young woman's life against its own reputation, and had chosen its reputation. Some of them never walked back through those doors. Nicholas Cavazos's grandfather was one of them, and he was not the only one. Feit was transferred into the Texas prison system. He filed an appeal raising multiple points of error, including arguments about the earlier plea agreement and about the admissibility of privileged testimony. It was never decided. On a Tuesday morning in February of 2020, officers at his unit found him unresponsive in his cell shortly before 5 in the morning. He was taken to a hospital in Huntsville and pronounced dead. He was 87 years old. His health had deteriorated badly in his final months, and his legal team had sought compassionate release. The courts denied it. He died in custody. He never expressed remorse. In 60 years, he never publicly acknowledged what he had done to Irene Garza, never apologized to her family, and never admitted his guilt to a court. He went out holding exactly the silence the institution had taught him to keep, and had helped him keep, for most of his adult life. When Noemi Sigler was told he had died, her response was quiet, and it was not triumphant. She said that he now stood before the ultimate judge, that he had left this earth never showing remorse for killing Irene, and she asked God to have mercy on his soul. The district attorney who made the promise and kept it won re-election in 2018, with close to 80% of the vote. The community had spoken again, louder than the first time. The district attorney who had refused to prosecute later said that the Garza case had murdered him politically. The Texas Ranger who led the reinvestigation starting in 2002 was in the courtroom for the verdict, and after 15 years of work on the file, he called it a relief. And Dale Tacheny, who had carried a confession for 40 years and finally set it down in front of 12 strangers, had done the only thing left available to him. He could not give Nicholas and Josefina Garza the answer. They were long dead. He could only give it to their family, 4 decades late, which is exactly what he did. Now go back to that letter. Not the church letter, the other one. The one Irene wrote 7 days before she died, to a friend, about ordinary things. The Parent-Teacher Association, her students, how shy she was and how she was working on it. And the part where she wrote that she used to be afraid of death, and that her faith had taken that fear away and given her a happiness she had not known was available to her. That is the woman this happened to. Not a case number, not a headline, not a body in a canal, not a name absent from a letter about a presidential campaign. She was the girl whose parents built a business from nothing and bought a house on the other side of the tracks in a town that had drawn those tracks on purpose. She was the first Latina to lead the band down a football field at McAllen High School, in front of a town that had never seen it and had never intended to. She was the first person in her family to hold a college degree, and then the first to go past it. She was the teacher who went back across those tracks on purpose, to a classroom full of children from the colonias, and spent her first paycheck on shoes for kids who came to school without any. She was the woman who went to Mass every single day, not out of obligation, but because she believed she was loved. She was the daughter who told her mother she would be right back. She was 25 years old. Her cousin called Irene their beacon of hope and said she was what gave them the strength to speak truth to power and to never give up. For 57 years, every system that was supposed to protect Irene Garza chose something else instead. The church she loved chose silence. The prosecutors who had the power to act chose political comfort. The community that adored her was told from a pulpit to stop asking and to stop even thinking. And her family did not stop. Noemi Sigler did not stop knocking on doors. Linda de la Vigna did not stop making phone calls. Dale Tacheny, 40 years late and knowing exactly how late he was, finally picked up a phone. And when one man stood in front of the voters of Hidalgo County and promised to do the thing that nobody before him had been willing to do, those voters did not simply elect a district attorney. They decided, after 57 years of enforced quiet, to stop being quiet. Justice arrived late. It arrived in a courtroom in Edinburg, Texas, in front of 7 women and 5 men, who looked at the evidence, heard the confession, read the letter, and decided that Irene Garza's life was worth more than any institution's comfort. Late. But it arrived. That is why these stories get told, because every victim deserves to be more than a file in a storage room. Every family deserves an answer, no matter how many decades it takes to get one. And every case that ends this way is proof that giving up was never the only option that was available. If Irene's story got to you, send it to one person who should hear it. And subscribe to Cold Case Model, because there are families still sitting exactly where hers sat for 57 years. And the only thing that has ever reliably worked for any of them is refusing to be quiet.